Howdy, y'alls. Welcome back. It's me, Dr. Edwards. This time, I'm here to go over our Module 5 material. And this week is really all about the second revolution, right? The agro-industrial revolution. And this is really all about using steam and internal combustion engines to drive agriculture and industry in general. All right. And from last week, we talked about intensive agriculture. Well, the agro-industrialism just ramps it up all the more. All right. So we're talking increased political centralization, increased population, increased land degradation. Right. So the same general model that we've outlined is just being multiplied. Right. So yeah, this is the world that we live in now. All right, the industrial complex. Okay, and it's important to realize when we're talking about the use of mechanization, steam power or internal combustion, that this essentially magnifies the productive potential of an individual, right? So an individual can produce all the more, which means that you have more people that don't necessarily need to produce food, which can then go specialize in other things. That's why we get the increased political centralization, more specialization, more ranking within society. These are, this is the same general pattern as before. Now, it's evolved to the point where we now live in large agricultural states, large industrial states. Yeah. But before we kind of got to where we are right now, this really started with steam power. All right. Now, steam power is you have a boiler, you heat water in it, and it produces steam, and you use that steam to drive a piston or a turbine or something like that, right? Now, the first fuel that was really used to produce for steam production was wood. But the wood wasn't very efficient. Okay? In fact, it was used for a bunch of other things. So it was using wood for steam power was in direct competition with using wood for building railroads and houses and all these other things that were going on. So it's not really until we get to the discovery and use of oil, right? Now, oil and coal. Sorry, coal comes before oil. It's not till we get to coal that we start seeing really increased use of industrial mechanization, and this is because it burns hotter, and at the time it wasn't being used for other things, so it was a perfect situation. Like, okay, we'll use coal for steam power, and steam power took off. Yeah. After coal, we have oil, right? And it just increases it again, right? However, this really brings up, looking at kind of, you can look at these fuel sources as, production per weight. All right, think of it like that. And so wood was minimal, coal increased it, oil. All right, so oil really made it all the more, well, coal and oil made industrialization all the more practical and achievable. Now, keep in mind that this is relatively new. Okay, this is only happening with the past 250 years, right? For coal, and past 150 years for oil. Remember, humans or human-like things have been around for millions of years, right? And for the vast majority of that time, we have been foragers, right? So this is really new stuff in the scope of human history. Yeah. It also means that because it's relatively new, we don't fully understand the consequences of industrialization. It's only been around for a little bit, okay? We understand the consequences of foraging a lot better because we can, look back in the archaeological and paleontological record, and we can get a good idea. Carrying capacity wasn't overburdened. All right, and that actually kind of brings us more into Caton. Okay, he applies ecological perspectives and principles to humans, right? Treating them like a species, not this unique animal, if you would, right? And he lays out carrying capacity and phantom carrying capacity. Now, as we've mentioned before, carrying capacity is how many individuals can subsist sustainably on a piece of land, right? Now, phantom carrying capacity is using external resources, right, to usually imported from the outside in some fashion, to essentially allow for increased carrying capacity. We talked about this before about kind of borrowing from the future. Okay, and this happens because we're actually these resources, fossil fuels, were produced millions of years ago. Right? They are limited. They are non-renewable, but we use fossil fuels to increase carrying capacity, and we call this phantom carrying capacity. All right. You could also think of importing food from another country. You could think of using ocean resources, right? No one really lives out in the ocean, so it's kind of a separate region. You might live on the coast, but you're going out into the ocean and harvesting fish, shellfish, maybe mammals, things like that, and yeah, or even oil. You have offshore drilling rigs. So yeah, all that really underscores this concept of phantom carrying capacity. Let's see here. Yeah, just looking at my notes. I put it in the written portion. Think of using these fossil fuels. It takes about 2,000 pounds. I mean tons, not pounds. 2,000 tons of biomass, right? Trees, critters, right? From millions of years ago, under intense heat and pressure to produce oil, and it takes about 2,000 tons of biomass to produce 1 barrel of oil, and that equates to about 20 gallons of gasoline. So think about that. Each time you fill your gas tank up, average gas tank on a car is 10 to 15 gallons or so, right? And yeah, just think about how much biomass it took in ancient history to produce that 1 gallon that you use probably in a day. All right, it really makes it evident that this consumption of past resources, right, or non-renewable resources, is set up for a crash, that you overshoot it. And this is where Caton really kind of makes a strong point that, well, actually take into consideration the time period that he was writing in, yeah, he would actually probably argue that we're past the overshoot stage and in the crash stage right now. But when he wrote it, he would definitely say we are in either overshoot or crash. Flipping through my notes. Yeah, Caton, I got some notes in the written portion of the lecture. He can be a little difficult, a little dense, all right? But he's you got to understand he's writing from a particular time period, right? So what he's describing as being current is old to us, but at the time it was current events, okay? And he's trying to give insight into human practices and patterns by looking at humans in an ecological perspective. So you can look in the 1970s, the oil embargo and energy crisis. All right, this is a direct response to, we might lay blame on particular groups, but that doesn't really work out because we're using the oil. We can't, we're using the fossil fuels. We can't blame others. We are complicit in that use, okay? And he points out a lot of myths and falsehoods, and replaces it with an ecological perspective. Like look at European colonization of the New World, right? this we often think of, manifest destiny and things like that. But another way to look at it, as Caton points out, is that immigration into the New World really was more about relieving various pressures in Europe, right? Overpopulation, overuse of resources, right? More land was needed, right? So yeah, it gives you kind of a different spin on things. Now, he also outlines that essentially through our use of these fossil fuels, our modern day way of life is threatened, right? And we do some funny things when things are threatened because this is the only way we have known our current selves, right? Particularly here in the West. We can't think of other ways of being, if you would. Okay, so what we end up doing is blaming other things, blaming the weather, blaming particular groups of people. Historically, back in the 70s and 80s, there was a trend of blaming Arabs, right? OPEC, oil embargo, all that good stuff, and it go figure. That's where you have these large, extractions centers for fossil fuels, and also we can see how this pattern of blame has kind of shifted, right? Still with kind of an Arab undertone, but today it's terrorists, right? It's no coincidence that where I used to live and work in West Africa, Mali in particular, U.S. has really ramped up its presence. Right, it's considered like the only successful democracy in West Africa, and the U.S. exploits that to gain greater control over fossil fuel resources that are present in Mali. Okay, often we'll blame the weather, right? That there's this drought, and the drought's to blame for this excessive use of resources or whatever. And again, all that is a scapegoat, right? It's just not looking at ourselves and our practices, but looking outside of ourselves, because it's hard to digest and accept that our practices are our own problem, right? We created this. Maybe not as individuals, but for the past 250 years or so, we made this. We always want to stress looking at the underlying ecological situation to give us greater insight into our practices. All right, and part of that requires that we turn a critical eye on ourselves, right, as a species, as something that inhabits this world and uses its resources. So that's where I'm going to leave this lecture, and I'm really looking forward to what you guys got to say in the discussion boards. Got some good stuff to draw on this week. I want to encourage you to be specific. Sink your teeth into it. Don't be bashful. All right. Looking forward to it. Check y'all later. Bye.